Unaware his wife inherited a $150 billion real estate company he worked for, he signed the divorce papers, mocking her until the judge read her mother's will. What she did next shocked him and left him devastated. The conference room on the 42nd floor held the scent of leather and ambition, but Daniel Matthews sat across from his wife of 7 years, with nothing except contempt twisting his features as he scrolled his signature across the final page. His wife, Catherine Reynolds, watched him with an expression he mistook for defeat, but the trembling in her hands came from restraint rather than weakness, as she clutched a sealed envelope bearing her late mother's law firm letterhead. The judge presiding over their dissolution hadn't yet opened the document that would transform the smirking regional property manager into a man who just mocked the woman who could end his career with a phone call. But Catherine's silence carried the weight of a revelation that would shatter everything Daniel thought he knew about power, wealth, and the quiet woman he'd underestimated for their entire marriage. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the dissolution papers, but Daniel Matthews felt nothing except the intoxicating satisfaction of a man who believed he was escaping the dead weight that had held him back for 7 years. His M-Lank pen, a gift from the Apex Global Holdings executive team after he'd closed the Phoenix District acquisition, moved across the signature line with the confidence of someone who thought he understood exactly what he was signing away. "I hope you realize this is the best thing that could happen to you, Catherine," Daniel said, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescension he'd perfected over their marriage. But his words held an irony he couldn't yet comprehend. "Maybe now you'll actually have to contribute something to society instead of just existing." Catherine Reynolds sat motionless in the leather chair that probably cost more than the monthly rent on the apartment she'd be keeping after today, but her stillness came from calculation rather than submission, her fingers pressed against the manila envelope that had arrived via courier that morning, 3 days after her mother's funeral, but she hadn't yet found the courage to break the wax seal that bore the Reynolds family crest. Judge Patricia Morrison reviewed the dissolution agreement with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd overseen hundreds of these proceedings, but she paused when she noticed the estate attorney's letter attached to Catherine's filing. "Mrs. Matthews, or would you prefer MS Reynolds now? There's a testamentary document here that needs to be entered into the record before I can finalize this dissolution." Daniel rolled his eyes with the exaggerated impatience of a man who had a lunch meeting with the vice president of acquisitions in 90 minutes, but his dismissive gesture would soon become the physical manifestation of his biggest professional mistake. "Can we speed this up? Some of us have actual jobs to get back to." The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin already pulled, but Daniel remained oblivious to the explosion that was coming. Catherine's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but she extended the envelope toward Judge Morrison with hands that shook from the effort of containing 7 years of accumulated rage rather than from fear. Judge Morrison broke the seal and began reading, but her eyebrows rose incrementally with each paragraph until her professional composure cracked entirely. "Mr. Matthews, you might want to pay attention to this." Daniel checked his Rolex, another gift from Apex Global Holdings, after he'd successfully negotiated the Atlanta portfolio expansion, but his attention remained fixed on his phone screen, where his girlfriend Melissa had just texted him about their Cancun trip planned for next week. "Whatever it is, I'm sure it's not relevant to our divorce. Catherine's mother died broke, just like Catherine will be once she's living off whatever scraps the court decides to give her." The cruelty in his voice created a moment of absolute silence in the conference room, but that silence became the last peaceful moment Daniel Matthews would experience for a very long time. Judge Morrison's expression transformed from professional neutrality to something that resembled a mixture of disbelief and second-hand embarrassment. "Mr. Matthews, I'm reading from the last will and testament of Margaret Elizabeth Reynolds," Judge Morrison said, her voice taking on the formal tone reserved for moments when legal proceedings became historically significant, but she paused to ensure Daniel was actually listening. "Are you aware that Margaret Reynolds served As the founding chair and majority shareholder of Reynolds Capital Consortium, Daniel's attention finally shifted from his phone to the judge, but his confusion manifested as irritation rather than comprehension. Never heard of it. Is this going to take much longer? Catherine's eyes closed briefly, but the gesture looked less like exhaustion and more like someone bracing for impact. She'd known this moment was coming since the attorney's courier had delivered the envelope, but experiencing it in real time felt different than she'd imagined during the sleepless nights since her mother's death. Judge Morrison continued reading, but her voice carried an edge that suggested she was taking some personal satisfaction in what was about to unfold. Reynolds Capital Consortium is the parent holding company of 47 subsidiary corporations, including, she paused for emphasis that Daniel still didn't understand, Apex Global Holdings. The conference room became a vacuum where sound existed, but meaning lagged several seconds behind. But Daniel's brain struggled to connect the dots that were forming a picture he couldn't afford to see. His mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged as the implications began their slow crawl toward his consciousness. The will specifies that upon Margaret Reynolds's death, her entire stake in Reynolds Capital Consortium, valued at approximately $150 billion, transfers immediately and irrevocably to her only child, Catherine Marie Reynolds Matthews. Judge Morrison continued, but now her eyes fixed on Daniel with an expression that mixed pity and contempt. That transfer was executed automatically upon Mrs. Reynolds's death 3 days ago, which means, Mr. Matthews, that as of 72 hours ago, your wife became the principal owner and chairwoman of company you work for. The words landed like physical blows, but Daniel's face cycled through expressions that would have been comical if they weren't so devastating to witness. Confusion giving way to disbelief. Disbelief collapsing into comprehension. Comprehension crystallizing into pure horror. The M-Lank pen slipped from his fingers and clattered against the mahogany table, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. That's impossible," Daniel whispered, but his voice carried no conviction because somewhere in his rapidly fragmenting psyche, pieces were clicking into place that he'd willfully ignored for 7 years. "Catherine doesn't work. She doesn't. She can't." Catherine spoke for the first time since they'd entered the conference room, but her voice carried a quality Daniel had never heard before. Not weakness, not submission, but the cool precision of someone who'd been playing a completely different game all along. "I've been attending board meetings every Tuesday for the past 7 years. Daniel, you thought I had book club." The revelation hit Daniel like a second wave, but this one carried the weight of every dismissive comment, every mocking joke, every casual cruelty he'd inflicted while thinking he held all the power in their relationship. His face drained of color as memory after memory reconstructed itself with this new catastrophic context. "The Tuesday morning meetings," Daniel said, his voice barely audible, but he was talking to himself now rather than anyone in the room. "The ones where we set regional policy, the ones where we—" He stopped, his hand rising to cover his mouth as nausea visibly gripped him. Catherine nodded slowly, but her expression remained neutral in a way that somehow felt more devastating than anger would have been. "The ones where you presented your quarterly reports, the ones where you lobbied so aggressively for the Phoenix promotion." She paused, letting the next words settle with maximum impact, "the ones where you repeatedly suggested that the company had too many legacy board members who didn't understand modern real estate and should clean house of anyone who wasn't pulling their weight." Daniel's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he realized he'd been advocating for his own wife's removal from the board while having no idea she was sitting in the room. But the implications went far deeper than simple embarrassment. Every business decision he'd made for 7 years had been observed, evaluated, and ultimately approved or rejected by the woman he'd been belittling at home. Judge Morrison cleared her throat, but her interruption felt almost merciful, given the psychological dismantling happening in front of her. The will also contained some specific instructions regarding Mrs. Reynolds's corporate governance in the event she was married at the time of her mother's inheritance, Catherine's fingers tightened on the armrest of her chair, but she kept her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Daniel's left shoulder. She knew what was coming because she'd read ahead in the document before the courier had even left her building, but hearing it spoken aloud in front of the man who'd spent 7 years systematically destroying herself, Worth created an entirely different emotional experience. Margaret Reynolds stipulated that if Catherine was married to Daniel Matthews at the time of inheritance, Catherine should use her newfound authority to demonstrate the difference between earned respect and demanded obedience. Judge Morrison read, but the quote felt like it had been written specifically for this moment. She further instructs that Catherine should help Daniel understand that true power lies not in title or position, but in the wisdom to recognize it in others. The words created a silence so profound that the ambient sounds of the city 42 floors below became audible through the triple-paned windows. But Daniel's mind was racing through scenarios that all ended with his career in ruins and his reputation destroyed. His hands trembled as he reached for the divorce papers he'd signed with such theatrical satisfaction just minutes earlier. We can tear these up," Daniel said, but his voice cracked with desperation that stripped away every pretense of the confident executive he'd performed for so long. "This doesn't have to change anything between us. We can work this out." Catherine finally looked directly at him, but what Daniel saw in her eyes wasn't the soft acquiescence he'd grown accustomed to exploiting. It was the cool assessment of someone calculating exactly how much mercy to extend, if any. "You signed them, Daniel. You mocked me while you signed them. You told the judge that you were relieved to finally be free of the burden of being married to someone who contributed nothing." Each quoted phrase landed with surgical precision, but Catherine's tone never rose above conversational volume. She'd learned from her mother that real power never needed to shout, but Daniel was only beginning to understand that lesson now, that it was far too late to benefit from it. Daniel's desperation metastasized into something uglier as the reality of his situation crystallized into pure panic. But his next words revealed exactly why Catherine had endured 7 years of marriage before reaching this moment. "You can't do this. I'll contest the will. I'll sue for half of everything. Community property laws in this state mean absolutely nothing when there's a prenuptial agreement that you signed without reading because you were so certain Catherine had nothing worth protecting." Judge Morrison interrupted, but her tone suggested she'd seen enough. "The prenup explicitly states that any inheritance received by either party during the marriage remains separate property." The document Daniel had signed 7 years ago, while joking about how Catherine's family had more pretension than pennies, now became the legal barrier between him and any claim to the fortune he'd just discovered existed. But the irony was so perfect it felt almost scripted. His face cycled through expressions again, this time from panic to rage, something that resembled a psychological break. "You manipulated me," Daniel said, but the accusation fell flat because everyone in the room understood who had actually been manipulating whom. "You let me think you were nobody. You let me believe I was the successful one." Catherine's composure finally cracked, but what emerged wasn't tears or anger. It was something far more devastating. She laughed, not hysterically, not bitterly, but with the genuine amusement of someone who'd finally reached the punchline of a 7-year joke. "I let you believe what you wanted to believe, Daniel," Catherine said, but her voice carried traces of something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so heavily mixed with contempt. "You never asked about my family. You never questioned how my mother afforded the penthouse you loved visiting. You never wondered why I had board meetings every Tuesday, but never discussed where they were held." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Catherine raised one hand in a gesture that silenced him with the unconscious authority of someone who'd spent 7 years watching board meetings and learning exactly how power operated in spaces where it didn't need to perform. "You assumed," Catherine continued, but now her voice carried the weight of 7 years of observations, indignities, and carefully catalogued slights. "You assumed I was nothing because I didn't perform ambition the way you did. You assumed my quietness meant weakness. You assumed my patience meant stupidity." She paused, and the next words came out with the precision of a surgeon making the final irreversible cut. You assumed you could treat me however you wanted because you thought there would never be consequences. The truth of her words hung in the air between them, but Daniel's face showed he was still trying to find an angle, still searching for the leverage he'd spent his entire career developing the instinct to exploit. His eyes darted around the room as if the expensive furniture might offer some escape route from the trap that had been 7 years in the making. "What are you going to do?" Daniel asked, but the question emerged as barely more than a whisper, because part of him already knew. The answer would be worse than he could imagine. Catherine stood, smoothing the simple black dress she'd worn to her mother's funeral and had never changed out of, but the gesture carried a finality that made Judge Morrison reach for the gavel she hadn't yet needed to use. "I'm going to accept this divorce, Daniel. I'm going to let you walk away from our marriage, exactly as you wanted." Relief flooded Daniel's features for approximately 3 seconds before Catherine's next words erased it completely, but those 3 seconds would later represent the last moment of hope he'd experienced for a very long time. "But I'm also going to accept my mother's advice," Catherine continued, but her tone shifted into something that sounded almost like regret, not for what she was about to do, but for the fact that doing it had become necessary. "I'm going to use my authority to demonstrate the difference between earned respect and demanded obedience." Daniel's throat worked as he tried to swallow, but his mouth had gone completely dry as the implications of her words began to sink in. "Catherine, please, I know I wasn't perfect, but you told the senior vice president of operations that board member K. Reynolds was probably some old woman who inherited her position and wouldn't know a good real estate deal if it hit her in the face," Catherine said. But she wasn't reading from notes. She was reciting from memory. That was 14 months ago during the Dallas portfolio review. Daniel's face went from white to gray as he realized she'd been there, had heard him, had said nothing while he'd systematically undermined the anonymous board member who turned out to be his own wife. But Catherine wasn't finished. "You presented my strategy recommendations as your own ideas at least 11 times that I counted," Catherine continued, but her voice remained steady even as she cataloged his professional plagiarism. "You built your reputation on insights you heard me discuss during our Tuesday morning meetings, then came home and told me I wouldn't understand business because I'd never worked a real job." Each revelation landed like a physical blow. But Daniel couldn't defend himself because the evidence existed in meeting minutes, recorded sessions, and email chains that would now be reviewed with catastrophic new context. His career hadn't been built on merit. It had been constructed from borrowed intelligence and opportunities created by the woman he'd been systematically belittling. Judge Morrison's gavel finally came down, but the sound felt anticlimactic given psychological devastation that had already occurred. "The dissolution is granted. Mrs. Reynolds or MS. Reynolds, as you'll legally be again, you're free to go." Catherine gathered her papers with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to control every visible emotion, but she paused at the door and turned back to face Daniel one final time. The conference room lights caught the tears that had finally formed in her eyes, but they didn't fall. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "I loved you, Daniel," Catherine said, but the past tense carried more weight than any present tense declaration could have held. "I loved you enough to hope that someday you'd see me as an equal instead of an accessory. I loved you enough to keep giving you chances to treat me with basic respect." She paused, and the next words came out with the finality of a door closing forever. "But my mother was right. Some people only understand power, and the only way to teach them anything is to show them they never had it in the first place." Daniel surged to his feet, but the gesture looked more like desperation than authority, as he realized this was his last chance to salvage something from wreckage of his life. "Catherine, wait. Please, we can fix this. I'll change. I'll be better. Just don't what?" Catherine interrupted, but her voice cracked slightly as the emotional weight of 7 years finally began to overwhelm her careful composure. "Don't fire you. Don't restructure the entire company around people who actually earned their positions. Don't tell everyone at Apex Global Holdings that their rising star regional manager built his career on stolen ideas and borrowed credibility. The questions hung in the air unanswered because Daniel had no response that wouldn't make things worse. But Catherine's expression softened into something that wasn't quite forgiveness, more like the sad recognition that some battles end not with victory, but with the exhaustion of having fought them at all. "I'm not going to fire you, Daniel," Catherine said, but the relief that flashed across his face vanished immediately when she continued. That would be too easy, too quick. She opened the conference room door, but paused with one hand on the frame. "I'm going to let you keep your job. I'm going to let you sit in your office and go to your meetings and present your reports, but every single day, you're going to know that every decision you make is being evaluated by the woman you mocked. Every promotion you don't get, every project you're passed over for, every time someone else gets the recognition you think you deserve, you'll wonder if it's merit or if it's me." The psychological torture she was proposing was so much worse than simple termination that Daniel's legs actually buckled slightly, but he caught himself on the edge of the table before he fell. His mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to form words that came out as a broken whisper. "That's cruel." Catherine's laugh was soft but genuine, carrying an edge of something that might have been madness if it wasn't so clearly earned. But her next words revealed the depth of calculation behind her mother's final instructions. "My mother always said, the cruelest thing you can do to someone who values power above everything is to show them they never had it." She called it the gift of perspective. She stepped through the doorway, but her voice drifted back one final time with words that would echo in Daniel's mind for years to come. "Consider this my final gift to you, Daniel, the chance to understand what it feels like to be underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed by someone who holds all the power. Maybe it'll make you a better person, but probably it'll just make you understand what you put me through for 7 years. The door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than any slam could have been. But Daniel stood frozen in the conference room as the full weight of his new reality settled onto his shoulders like a physical burden. Judge Morrison gathered her papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd witnessed something she'd be telling her colleagues about for years, but would never quite be able to fully capture in the retelling. "For what it's worth, Mr. Matthews," Judge Morrison said as she prepared to leave, but her tone suggested the worth would be minimal. "You should probably start updating your resume. Something tells me Apex Global Holdings is about to have a lot of openings in upper management." Daniel collapsed back into his chair as the judge left, but his mind was racing through the wreckage of his professional life and finding no safe ground anywhere. Every relationship he'd cultivated, every alliance he'd formed, every political maneuver he'd executed had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. The assumption that he was valuable, that he was rising, that he mattered. His phone buzzed with a text from Melissa asking if they were still on for dinner, but the words looked like they'd been written in a foreign language because the man who'd made those plans no longer existed. That Daniel Matthews had been a successful regional property manager dating a beautiful younger woman while smugly divorcing the wife he'd outgrown. This Daniel Matthews was a middle-aged man who just discovered his entire career was a participation trophy handed to him by the woman he'd betrayed. The conference room door opened again, but it was Catherine's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, who'd sat silently through the entire proceeding, but now approached with the confident stride of someone delivering a prepared statement. "Ms. Reynolds asked me to inform you that the board will be conducting a comprehensive review of all regional management decisions from the past 7 years, Patricia said, but her tone was professionally neutral in a way that somehow made the words more threatening. "She wants to ensure that all promotions and commendations were based on actual merit rather than other factors." Daniel's stomach dropped as he realized Catherine wasn't just leaving him in place to suffer. She was systematically deconstructing every achievement he'd ever claimed. But Patricia wasn't finished. She also wanted me to mention that the company's ethics hotline has been updated to include anonymous reporting options for employees who may have witnessed inappropriate behavior from management. Patricia continued, but now her expression carried just a hint of satisfaction. Apparently, There's been some concern about managers taking credit for subordinates' work. The message was clear. Catherine wasn't just going to torture Daniel with uncertainty. She was creating avenues for everyone he'd ever stolen from, dismissed, or mistreated to come forward with their stories. But the legal framework would protect them while exposing him. It was elegant, methodical, and absolutely devastating. "She's destroying me," Daniel whispered. But the words came out with a mixture of awe and horror, because he was finally understanding the level of intelligence he'd been dismissing as worthlessness for 7 years. Patricia's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been contempt or might have been pity. They looked remarkably similar from Daniel's new perspective. "No, Mr. Matthews, she's revealing you. There's a difference." The attorney left without waiting for a response, but Daniel remained in the conference room long after everyone else had gone. The city lights below began to glow as afternoon transitioned into evening, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the space where his entire life had detonated. His phone continued buzzing with messages. Melissa asking where he was, his assistant reminding him about tomorrow's meeting with the Dallas team, his mother checking if he wanted to have dinner this weekend. None of them knew yet that the Daniel Matthews they thought they knew had been revealed as a construction built on theft, arrogance, and the patience of a woman he'd never bothered to actually see. But they'd all find out soon enough. The real question was what would be left of him once all the borrowed glory had been stripped away, and the only thing remaining was the man who'd been there all along. Daniel's hands shook as he finally reached for his phone. But instead of responding to any messages, he opened his email and searched for every communication he had ever sent that mentioned K. Reynolds. The results populated slowly, but each one represented another moment where he'd undermined, dismissed, or mocked the board member who'd been his wife. "How do we justify keeping Reynolds on the board when she contributes nothing to discussions?" he'd written in one email. "K. Reynolds' suggestion about sustainable development is naive and impractical," appeared in another. "The sooner we can remove legacy board members like Reynolds, the faster we can modernize this company," showed up in a message sent to 3 other regional managers who'd all copied Catherine's executive assistant without knowing it. The paper trail of his arrogance stretched back years, but now every message would be read with the knowledge that he'd been systematically attacking his own wife while benefiting from her insights and her family's company. The humiliation was so complete, so absolute that Daniel actually laughed, a broken, desperate sound that echoed in the empty conference room. His phone rang and Melissa's face appeared on the screen, but Daniel couldn't bring himself to answer because explaining what had happened would require admitting a level of stupidity he wasn't sure he could voice aloud. The call went to voicemail, and then another came through immediately. Afterward, "Danny, where are you? I'm at the restaurant and you're 20 minutes late." Melissa's voice chirped through the speaker because he'd forgotten to silence it. Did something happen with the divorce? Is everything okay? Everything was not okay. Everything was so far from okay that okay existed. In a different universe where Daniel Matthews had been a better husband, a more observant person, and someone who'd valued his wife enough to actually learn who she was. But that universe had never existed. This universe, the real one, was the place where Catherine Reynolds had spent 7 years documenting his failures while waiting for the moment when she'd have the authority to ensure he understood exactly what he'd thrown away. Daniel finally stood on legs that felt unreliable, but he made his way to the elevator with the slow, careful movements of someone who'd aged decades in age. Single afternoon, the building directory in the lobby caught his eye as he passed. Apex Global Holdings occupied floors 35 through 44, but he'd never noticed that the executive suite on 44 was reserved for the board chair's office, Catherine's office, his wife's office, the office of the woman he'd been mocking for 7 years while she literally worked directly above him. But the physical metaphor was so perfect, it felt like the universe itself was mocking him. Now the elevator doors opened to reveal 3 of his colleagues from the regional management team, but their conversation died instantly when they saw his face. Whatever expression he was wearing apparently communicated that something catastrophic had occurred, but none of them asked because corporate culture dictated that visible weakness was something to avoid rather than address. Matthew's Greg Sullivan nodded, but his eyes darted away quickly. Heard the divorce was today. Congratulations on your freedom. The words landed with unintentional irony that made Daniel want to laugh or scream or possibly both, but he managed a sound that might have passed for acknowledgement in the dim lighting of the elevator car. Ride down 42 floors took approximately 90 seconds, but it felt like descending through layers of hell that got progressively worse with each passing floor. His car sat in its assigned parking space in the executive garage, a perk he'd earned through 7 years of climbing what he'd thought was merit-based ladder, but now understood was a carefully managed illusion. But the Mercedes sedan Catherine had helped him pick out suddenly felt like evidence in a trial where every artifact of his success would be recontextualized as charity. Daniel sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, but his phone continued buzzing with messages from a life that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Melissa wanted to know where he was. His assistant needed him to review the quarterly projections. His mother sent a recipe she thought he'd like. Every message represented a connection to the person he'd been that morning. Confident, successful, dismissive Daniel Matthews, who thought he understood how power worked. The man sitting in the car now understood that he'd never had power at all, but he'd been performing it so convincingly that he'd fooled everyone except the one person who actually mattered. Catherine had seen through him from the beginning, but she'd loved him enough to hope he'd change. When that hope died, probably years before she'd finally filed for divorce, she'd simply waited for the moment when she'd have the authority to teach him the lesson her mother had apparently been planning all along. His phone rang again, but this time the caller ID showed Apex Global Holdings Executive Office. Daniel's hand trembled as he answered, but no sound came out when he tried to speak. "Mr. Matthews, this is Jennifer Park from the Executive Office," a professional voice said, but the formality in her tone suggested this wasn't a social call. "MS, Reynolds has asked me to inform you that there will be an all-staff meeting tomorrow morning at 9:00 a.m. to introduce the new board chair. Your attendance is mandatory." The call ended before Daniel could respond, but the message was clear. Catherine was going to reveal herself to the entire company, and Daniel would be sitting in that audience, knowing that everyone would soon understand the full scope of his humiliation. Some of them would already know because corporate gossip moved faster than official communications. But by tomorrow afternoon, every employee at Apex Global Holdings would understand that their rising star regional manager had spent 7 years mocking his own wife while stealing her ideas. Daniel finally started the car, but he had nowhere to go that would offer sanctuary from what he'd done. His apartment, the one Catherine had agreed to let him keep in the divorce, would be filled with furniture they'd picked out together and photos documenting 7 years of a marriage he'd systematically dismantled through casual cruelty and willful blindness. He drove aimlessly through the city as night fully descended, but the lights that should have represented opportunity and possibility now just illuminated the scope of his failure. Every building owned by Apex Global Holdings, and there were hundreds of them scattered across the skyline, now represented Catherine's empire and his borrowed credibility. The next morning arrived with the inevitability of a judicial sentence, but Daniel dragged himself into the office wearing the same suit from yesterday because he hadn't been able to face his apartment. He'd slept fitfully in his car in a parking garage, waking every few hours to the reality that nothing had changed except his understanding of how thoroughly he'd destroyed his own life. The conference center on the 44th floor was packed with employees from every division, but Daniel found a seat in the back row where he hoped to remain invisible. The energy in the room carried that particular buzz of anticipated change. People knew something significant was happening, but most didn't yet understand what. The lights dimmed, and Catherine walked onto the stage, wearing a tailored navy suit that Daniel had never seen before. But her presence commanded the room in a way that made it clear she'd been preparing for this moment far longer than 3 days. Her hair was pulled back severely, and her expression carried none of the softness. He'd spent 7 years mistaking weakness. "Good morning," Catherine said, but her voice projected with the natural authority of someone who'd been trained since birth to command rooms full of people who controlled billions in assets. "My name is Catherine Reynolds, and as of 72 hours ago, I became the principal owner and board chair of Reynolds Capital Consortium and all its subsidiary companies, including Apex Global Holdings." The room erupted in whispers, but Catherine waited patiently for silence to return before continuing. Daniel sank lower in his seat, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the woman he'd married and never actually known. "Some of you have worked with me over the years without knowing my full identity," Catherine continued, but her eyes swept the audience and landed briefly on Daniel before moving on. "I've been attending board meetings and contributing to strategic decisions since before many of you joined this company. My mother, Margaret Reynolds, believed in preparing the next generation of leadership by having them earn respect before revealing authority." The explanation was elegant and positioned Catherine as humble rather than deceptive. But Daniel understood the real message. She'd been testing everyone, evaluating who treated the anonymous board member, Kay Reynolds, with respect and who dismissed her based on assumptions. He'd failed that test spectacularly. "Over the next several months, we'll be conducting a comprehensive review of all management decisions and personnel evaluations," Catherine said, but the announcement sent visible tension through the executive rows near the front. "My mother believed that true leadership recognizes talent in others rather than demanding recognition for itself. We'll be ensuring that Apex Global Holdings reflects those values going forward." The speech continued for another 20 minutes, but Daniel barely heard the words because his mind was consumed with calculating exactly how many people he'd undermined, dismissed, or stolen credit from during his 7 years at the company. Every face in the audience represented a potential witness to his ethical failures, but Catherine's methodical approach meant she'd give all of them the opportunity to come forward with their stories. The meeting finally ended, but Daniel remained in his seat as the conference center emptied around him. Catherine stood at the front of the room speaking with several board members, but her posture radiated the confidence of someone who'd spent 7 years preparing for exactly this moment. She glanced back at Daniel once before leaving, but her expression carried no anger, no satisfaction, no emotion he could identify, just the cool assessment of someone who'd already moved past him into a future where he existed, only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating quiet people. Daniel Matthews sat alone in the empty conference center as the cleaning crew began their work around him, but he couldn't bring himself to move because standing up would mean accepting the reality of what came next. His phone buzzed one final time with a message from Melissa. "We need to talk. I saw the news about your wife. Why didn't you tell me she owns the company?" The relationship that had felt like his prize for escaping his marriage now revealed itself as another casualty of his arrogance. But Daniel realized with sudden crushing clarity that Melissa had never been interested in him. She'd been interested in the successful executive who appeared to be climbing toward greater power and influence. That person no longer existed. That person had been a fiction enabled by Catherine's patience and her mother's vast fortune. But the fiction had been so convincing that even Daniel had believed it. Now the only thing left was the truth. He was a mediocre manager who'd stumbled into opportunity through marriage and destroyed it through cruelty. The devastation Catherine had promised wasn't his job or his reputation or his relationship. It was the revelation that he'd never been who he thought he was. And the man underneath all those borrowed accomplishments was someone he didn't recognize and wasn't sure he could live with knowing. Daniel finally stood and walked out of the conference center into a world that looked identical to yesterday, but operated on completely different rules. Rules where Catherine Reynolds held all the power, and he was just another employee hoping to survive. Whatever came next, the shock of that transition, the devastation of understanding exactly what he'd thrown away, would stay with him far longer than any formal punishment could have managed. Catherine had given him exactly what her mother suggested, perspective, and it was destroying him one agonizing revelation at a time. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Catherine's office on the 44th floor, casting geometric patterns across the mahogany desk that had once belonged to her mother. But the light felt different now, less like exposure and more like illumination. Catherine stood at the window overlooking the city, her reflection in the glass showing a woman who'd grown into authority rather than simply inherited it. But the transformation had required her to confront parts of herself she'd spent years avoiding. The quarterly board meeting had concluded an hour earlier, and the manila folder on her desk contained Daniel's performance review, a document she'd been avoiding reading for 3 days. But avoidance had never been her mother's style, and Catherine was determined not to let it become hers. She opened the folder with steady hands, though her heart rate accelerated slightly as she scanned the summary prepared by the Human Resources team. Daniel Matthews had become invisible, not fired, not demoted, but systematically overlooked in ways that were impossible to prove, were intentional yet devastating in their cumulative effect. But the review revealed something Catherine hadn't expected. His work quality had actually improved dramatically over the past 6 months. Fewer errors, more thorough analysis, genuine collaboration with team members he'd previously dismissed. The change had come too late to save his reputation, but it suggested something that made Catherine's carefully maintained composure crack slightly. He'd been capable of being better all along. He simply hadn't needed to be better when he'd had her authority protecting him without his knowledge. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, but Catherine welcomed the distraction as Jennifer Park, her executive assistant, entered with her usual efficient manner. "Ms. Reynolds, Daniel Matthews is here. He says he doesn't have an appointment, but he's requesting 5 minutes of your time." Catherine's first instinct was to refuse. She'd successfully avoided any direct interaction with Daniel since the divorce finalization 6 months ago, but curiosity won over self-preservation. "Send him in." Daniel entered looking like a man who'd aged a decade in half a year, but the transformation went deeper than the gray threading through his hair or the weight he'd lost. His posture had changed. Less performance, more genuine humility, though Catherine remained cautious about trusting surfaces after spending 7 years married to his performances. "Thank you for seeing me," Daniel said, but he remained standing near the door, as if uncertain whether he'd been granted permission to approach further. "I know I have no right to your time." Catherine gestured to the chair across from her desk, but she didn't sit herself. Maintaining the physical advantage felt necessary given the psychological vulnerability this conversation represented. "You have 5 minutes, Daniel. I suggest you use them efficiently." He nodded and moved to the chair, but he perched on its edge rather than settling in, and his hands twisted together in a gesture Catherine remembered from their early dating years, before success had smoothed away his rough edges and replaced them with the polished arrogance that had ultimately destroyed their marriage. "I'm not here to apologize," Daniel said, but the statement made Catherine's eyebrows rise because that had been exactly what she'd expected. "I mean, I am sorry. Desperately, completely, devastatingly sorry for everything I did and said and thought during our marriage. But I've spent 6 months apologizing to everyone I wronged, and I've realized that apologies are just words when the behavior demonstrated the opposite for years." Catherine remained silent, but her expression encouraged him to continue, even as her mind catalogued this new version of Daniel against all the previous iterations she'd known. "I came here to tell you that you were right," Daniel continued. But his voice cracked slightly on the admission about everything, about me needing to understand what it felt like to be dismissed and overlooked, about the difference between earned respect and demanded obedience, about power and perspective, and all the lessons you tried to teach me that I was too arrogant to learn. The words hung between them, but Catherine still didn't respond because she'd learned from 6 months of board meetings that silence often revealed more than questions. "I see myself clearly now," Daniel said. But tears were forming in his eyes, even as he maintained eye contact with an effort that looked physically painful. I see the man I was, and I'm horrified, not because of what I lost, though I lost everything that mattered, but because of who I became when I thought I had power. I was cruel. I was dismissive. I was everything my father was before my mother finally left him, and I swore I'd never become that person. But I became worse because at least he was honest about being a bastard. The reference to his father was new information. Daniel had rarely discussed his childhood during their marriage, but Catherine filed it away as context rather than excuse. Understanding why someone had become cruel didn't erase the impact of their cruelty. The worst part is that you loved me, Daniel continued. But now the tears were falling freely down his face, even as his voice remained steady. You actually loved me, Catherine. Not the performance, not the potential, but me. And I took that love, and I twisted it into something that served me while destroying you. And I did it so casually that I didn't even notice until you showed me what I'd done. Catherine felt her own eyes burning, but she'd spent 6 months building walls around the parts of herself that Daniel had damaged, and she wasn't ready to tear them down simply because he'd finally developed the capacity for genuine remorse. Why are you telling me this, Daniel? Because I'm leaving, Daniel said simply. But the announcement landed with more weight than Catherine had expected. I'm resigning from Apex Global Holdings effective at the end of the month. I've accepted a position with a nonprofit housing organization in Detroit. The pay is about a quarter of what I made here, but the work is actually helping people instead of just moving money around to benefit people who already have too much. Catherine blinked, trying to reconcile this information with the Daniel she'd known, but the pieces didn't fit together in any pattern she recognized. You're walking away from real estate. I'm walking away from the person I became in real estate. Daniel corrected, but his expression carried something that might have been peace if it wasn't so heavily weighted with regret. Every building I see in this city reminds me of something I stole, or someone I hurt, or some moment where I could have been better but chose to be worse. I can't heal here, Catherine, and more importantly, you can't heal while I'm still occupying space in your world. The consideration for her well-being felt foreign coming from him, but Catherine detected no manipulation in his tone, just exhaustion and genuine concern, though she remained wary of trusting her ability to read him, given how thoroughly he'd deceived her before. What about Melissa? Catherine asked, but the question emerged before she could stop it, revealing that she'd been keeping tabs on his personal life even while avoiding direct contact. Daniel's laugh was bitter but genuine, carrying no trace of the performance laughter she remembered from their marriage. Melissa left approximately 3 hours after the news broke about who you were. She sent me a text message that said, "You're either incredibly stupid or incredibly unlucky, and either way, I'm not interested." She wasn't wrong. The pettiness of finding satisfaction in his romantic failure weared with the part of Catherine that had spent 6 months trying to rise above the need for revenge. But she allowed herself a small smile before her professional mask returned. "So, you're running away?" Yes, Daniel agreed without hesitation, but his honesty was more disarming than any excuse would have been. "Absolutely, completely. I'm running away because staying here means watching you be brilliant and successful while knowing I had the chance to support that and chose to undermine it instead. I'm running away because every person in this building knows what I did and I deserve their contempt, but I can't grow while drowning in it." Catherine moved around her desk and sat in the chair beside Daniel rather than across from him, but the gesture felt risky in ways she couldn't fully articulate. "You know what's funny? When I imagined this moment, and I imagined it a lot during our marriage, I always thought I'd feel triumphant, victorious, like I'd finally won something after years of losing. And instead, Daniel asked, but his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Instead, I just feel tired," Catherine admitted. But the confession felt like removing armor she'd been wearing so long she'd forgotten how heavy it was. I spent 7 years documenting your failures and planning this revenge, and it was satisfying for about 3 days. Then it just became another job, another performance, another version of me hiding what I actually felt behind what I thought I should feel." They sat in silence for a moment, but the quiet felt different than the terrible silences of their marriage, less loaded, more honest, though still carrying the weight of everything that couldn't be unsaid or undone. "I don't forgive you," Catherine said finally, but her voice was gentle rather than harsh. "I might never forgive you, Daniel. What you did wasn't just cruel. It was sustained cruelty over years while I kept hoping you'd see me. That's not something that gets erased by 6 months of improved behavior and a temporary confession." "I know," Daniel said, but he didn't sound defensive, just accepting. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Catherine. I'm just trying to tell you that what you did, showing me who I really was instead of who I pretended to be, it worked. It destroyed me. But sometimes things need to be destroyed before something better can grow from the wreckage." Catherine reached over and took his hand, but the gesture felt more like a farewell than a reconciliation, and from Daniel's expression, he understood the distinction. "I hope you find whatever you're looking for in Detroit. I genuinely hope you become the person you should have been all along. What about you?" Daniel asked, but he squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "What happens to Catherine Reynolds now that she's proven she can wield power? Does she become the kind of person who uses it wisely, or does she become someone like me?" The question struck deeper than Catherine had expected. She'd been asking herself the same thing every day for 6 months, as she'd systematically dismantled careers and restructured departments with the ruthless efficiency her mother had trained her to deploy. "I don't know yet, but I'm trying to be someone my mother would be proud of, someone who uses authority to create opportunity rather than to settle scores." Daniel stood and Catherine rose with him, but the physical distance between them felt like it represented more than just 3 ft of expensive carpeting. It was the gulf between who they'd been together and who they'd become apart. "For what it's worth," Daniel said as he moved toward the door, but he paused with his hand on the handle. "You were always too good for me. I just wish I'd been smart enough to realize that while it mattered." He left without waiting for a response, but Catherine remained standing in her office as his footsteps faded down the hallway toward the elevators. The manila folder on her desk contained his performance review, but she closed it without adding any comments because Daniel Matthews was no longer her problem to solve or her damage to inflict. Jennifer appeared in the doorway minutes later with Catherine's afternoon schedule, but she paused when she noticed her boss's expression. "M. Reynolds, are you all right?" Catherine considered the question with genuine contemplation rather than reflexive reassurance, but the answer required more honesty than she usually deployed at work. "I'm not sure yet. Ask me again in 6 months." The afternoon proceeded with the usual cascade of meetings, decisions, and strategic discussions that filled Catherine's days, but her mind kept returning to Daniel's visit and the question he'd posed about what kind of person she would become now that she understood how to wield power effectively. That evening, Catherine stood in her mother's former penthouse, now her penthouse, and opened the leather journal Margaret Reynolds had kept throughout her decades of business leadership. But the pages contained more than just corporate strategy. They held reflections on the cost of power, the burden of authority, and the constant vigilance required to ensure that success didn't calcify into the same arrogance she'd spent her life combating in others. One entry dated 3 years before her mother's death read, "Catherine will inherit everything, but the real question is whether she'll inherit my mistakes along with my assets. Power reveals character, but it also corrupts it. I can only hope I've taught her to remain vigilant against her own potential for cruelty." The words hit Catherine like cold water because she'd been so focused on punishing Daniel that she hadn't considered whether her systematic dismantling of his career and reputation had transformed her into a different version of the same person, someone who used power to inflict suffering rather than to create positive change. She picked up her phone and called her attorney, but the conversation was brief and left Patricia Chen sounding slightly confused. You want to terminate the ethics review in Daniel Matthews' past conduct, but we've uncovered significant evidence of misconduct that I know. Catherine interrupted, but her voice carried a certainty that had been absent during their previous discussions. End it. Let him leave quietly. He's already been punished enough, and continuing the investigation serves no purpose except my own satisfaction. Are you sure about this, Catherine? Patricia asked, but her tone suggested she already knew the answer. No, Catherine admitted, but the honesty felt liberating rather than weak. But my mother always said, the hardest thing about having power is knowing when not to use it. Daniel's leaving. He's broken. Continuing to grind him down doesn't make me strong. It just makes me cruel, and I've spent 6 months proving I'm not who he thought I was. I don't want to spend the next 6 becoming who he was. The call ended, and Catherine sat in the growing darkness of the penthouse. But she didn't turn on the lights because the shadows felt appropriate for the moment of reckoning she was experiencing. Revenge had been satisfying, but it had also been consuming, and she'd started to feel herself disappearing into the role of the wronged woman, dispensing justice rather than the person she'd actually wanted to become. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Thank you. I don't deserve your mercy, but I'm grateful for it anyway. I hope you build something amazing, Catherine. You always had that ability. I was just too blind to see it. D. Catherine didn't respond because there was nothing left to say that would change the past or improve the future. But she saved the message in a folder she labeled reminders, evidence that growth was possible, that people could change, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do with authority was choose not to exercise it. 6 months after that, Catherine stood in front of the board of directors presenting a new initiative that would redirect 30% of Reynolds Capital Consortium's profits toward affordable housing development in underserved communities. But the proposal met significant resistance from board members who saw it as abandoning the company's profit first mandate. My mother built this company on the principle that real estate shapes communities and lives. Catherine said, but her voice carried the confidence of someone who'd stopped performing authority and started embodying it. She believed that having power meant having responsibility. I'm proposing we honor that legacy by ensuring our success creates opportunity for others rather than just accumulating wealth for ourselves. The vote was close, but the initiative passed, and Catherine left the boardroom feeling like she'd finally stepped out of her mother's shadow, while still honoring everything Margaret Reynolds had tried to teach her. But the real test came 3 weeks later, when she received a letter postmarked from Detroit. Catherine almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity won over caution, and she opened the envelope to find a single page covered in Daniel's familiar handwriting, though the words themselves felt like they'd been written by someone else entirely. Catherine, I saw the news about your affordable housing initiative. The nonprofit I work for is already benefiting from similar programs, and I've seen first, and the difference they make in people's lives. You're doing exactly what you should be doing, using your authority to create opportunity rather than consolidate power. I'm not writing to insert myself back into your life. I'm writing because I thought you should know that the lesson you taught me, that real strength comes from lifting others up rather than putting them down. I'm passing that on every day to the families we help find housing. Your impact extends far beyond anything you could measure, and it started with the mercy of showing me who I really was instead of simply destroying me for it. I'll never stop being sorry for what I did to you, but I'm learning to channel that regret into something productive rather than just drowning in it. I hope you're finding peace too. With respect and gratitude, Daniel Catherine read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in the same folder where she'd saved his text message. But this time, she added a new label, Evidence of Change. The folder represented something her mother had never quite captured in her journal. The idea that power's greatest achievement wasn't in punishing the guilty or rewarding the loyal, but in creating conditions where people could become better versions of themselves. 2 years after the divorce, Catherine Reynolds sat in her office overlooking the city she'd helped reshape through strategic development that balanced profit with social responsibility. But the view looked different than it had when she'd first inherited her authority. Buildings that had once represented her mother's legacy now represented her own vision, and the company that had been a burden of expectation had transformed into an expression of possibility. She'd stopped tracking Daniel's whereabouts after that letter, but occasional news reached her through mutual connections. He was still in Detroit, still working in nonprofit housing, apparently engaged to a social worker he'd met through his work. The information arrived without the sharp pain that would have accompanied it years earlier, but with something closer to genuine hope that both of them had found ways to grow from the wreckage of their marriage. Catherine's own life had filled with new relationships, new challenges, and new understanding of who she was beyond the definitions others had imposed. Not just the wronged wife, not just the eyes, not just the powerful executive, but someone still learning to balance strength with compassion and authority with humility. The manila folder, labeled Evidence of Change, remained in her desk drawer, but she rarely opened it anymore because she'd moved beyond needing proof that people could grow. She carried that knowledge in the way she conducted business, treated employees, and exercised the authority that had once felt like a weapon and now felt more like a tool for construction rather than destruction. Sometimes late at night, when the city lights blurred into abstract patterns against her windows, Catherine wondered what would have happened if Daniel had been capable of seeing her clearly during their marriage. If the 7 years of documented cruelty had never occurred, if she'd never had to deploy her mother's final lesson about power and perspective, but those thoughts always ended the same way. The woman she'd become had been forged in the fire of being systematically underestimated and then given the authority to prove everyone wrong. Daniel's cruelty had been the catalyst for her transformation. But her choice to eventually show mercy had completed it, turning her from someone wielding power to someone understanding it. The story of their marriage would never have a happy ending because some damage couldn't be undone and some betrayals couldn't be forgiven. But it had found something better than happiness. It had found meaning. Catherine had learned that being underestimated wasn't weakness, that quiet strength could be more powerful than loud authority, and that the choice to show mercy when you had every right to be ruthless was perhaps the truest measure of character. Daniel had learned that borrowed power was just performance, that real respect had to be earned through consistent behavior rather than demanded through position, and that devastation could be the first step toward transformation if you had the courage to actually change instead of just apologizing for staying the same. The divorce papers that had once represented Daniel's triumph and Catherine's humiliation now sat in an archive somewhere, but their significance had transformed over time. Not the ending of something that had been good, but the documentation of the moment when two people finally stopped performing for each other and started becoming who they actually were. And in the final accounting, that revelation had been more valuable than anything the marriage had ever offered. Devastating, yes, shocking, absolutely, but also necessary. The kind of necessary that only becomes clear when you've survived it and discovered that survival itself can be a form of victory. Catherine Reynolds closed her laptop as the sun set over the city she'd helped reshape. But she didn't feel triumphant or vindicated, just quietly satisfied that she'd used her inheritance to become someone her mother would respect, and more importantly, someone she could respect herself. And somewhere in Detroit, Daniel Matthews locked the door to the nonprofit housing office where he'd spent another long day helping families find stability and dignity. But he carried with him the understanding that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a future that slowly, painfully, honorably outweighed it. They would never speak again. They would never reconcile. The damage done couldn't be undone. But the people they'd become because of it, and sometimes despite it, were evidence that even the most devastating revelations could plant seeds of growth in the wreckage they created. Power revealed character, but mercy defined it. And the space between those two truths was where real growth occurred. Painful, necessary, and ultimately transformative in ways that neither Catherine nor Daniel could have predicted when they'd signed those divorce papers in a conference room that felt like a lifetime ago.